Martin Luther King, who whose children ended up in an independent school, correct? You're right.
Well, not at first, but
Okay.
but ultimately, yes.
Ultimately. So here's a
Yes.
quote from him. Our sole purpose in making application, King stated at the time, for our son Martin III was a sincere attempt to secure for him the best possible secondary education. This was not meant to be any sort of a test case, though we do desire for our son the experience of integrated schooling. Martin Luther King. You know, I often think about this. I wasn't looking for a test study either. I just wanted some really great education. So talk to us a little bit about the Fearless First. Maybe introduce them to us, their
Sure.
names, and a little bit about where you think their parents' head was at, similar to Martin's. What were they thinking? Why were they going for independent schools? And what did they also have to consider?
Sure. I will, as a bit of a backdrop to getting to the Fearless First, I'll just talk a little bit about this time period, right? The 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. And I will share with you all a screenshot of a slide that I use when talking about the book. It's a um, historical snapshot of the book across the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So hopefully everybody can see this slide. So really, right, the whole point of the book was to really think about what started out as a question for me over, 15 years ago now, when I was starting my PhD program, were who were the first Black students to go to elite private schools in the South, right? I wanted to know who came before me, as someone who is an alum, an Alpha Omega graduate, meaning I went K through 12th grades at St. Andrew's Episcopal School in Jackson, Mississippi. And so really, like you said in the beginning, right, the 50s brought Brown versus Board of Education, as we see here, but elite private schools were not beholden to that decision, right? No matter where they were located. And so the 50s and the 60s are happening, and we have the Brown decision, but then we have great resistance to the Brown decision. We obviously have the civil rights movement happening, massive resistance at every turn to Black folks gaining civil rights, right? And then we have this rise of these segregationist academies. So private schools were actually an outlet so that white folks would not have to send their kids to desegregated schools, as public school desegregation gradually occurred over the 50s and the 60s, right? So with that particular quote in the Atlanta scenario, right? So Atlanta's been kind of marching along, known as the city too busy to hate. So Atlanta was not wanting to be Birmingham. Atlanta was not wanting to be Little Rock. Atlanta was home to Coca-Cola. It was home to other major businesses, right? Hartsfield had already been scouting the land in the 30s for what is now Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport. Atlanta was on the move, right? And so, but they did have this test case, right? Or multiple test cases in the early 60s, including the King family applying for Martin Luther King III to be admitted to the Lovett School. And ultimately, Lovett at that time was intimately connected with the Episcopal Church, meaning they were partners in their educational pursuits. But Lovett decided not to admit Martin Luther King III, and as a result, split from the Episcopal Church. At the same time that's happening, independent schools nationally, however, are actually trying to figure out, how do we get more Black students, right? So their heartstrings are being pulled out because of the civil rights movement. You can't not live in the United States in the 1960s and not see what's happening in the civil rights movement because of the television, right? They also know that the federal government is getting more and more involved in both public school policy and private school policy. So the question of tax exemption status was on the table already in the early 60s. So if you continue not to have Black students at all, or very few, what is that going to mean for your tax exemption status, right? And then it's also a public relations issue. They don't want to be like these segregationist academies that are popping up, because they don't think the segregationist academies have the same academic standards as they, right? So all this being said, right, all of these things are happening in the 50s, 60s, and ultimately my case study, in which I look at Westminster in Atlanta, decides to desegregate in 1965. right? There's been some internal push and pull in that school. But the head of Westminster is actually one of the leaders of the independent school world. So he's been chair of the National Council of Independent Schools, which is the predecessor organization to NEIS. And then he's a founding trustee of NEIS. So he's a Southern leader, but he's also a national leader, very much aware of all these issues happening nationally, right? But they said they couldn't find any first Black students for 1966, that there were no qualified Black applicants to start in the fall of 66, right? So they go back to work trying to find some quote unquote qualified Black students for 1967. And by this time, Atlanta public school desegregation is happening on a very gradual basis, a very kind of token basis at first, very gradual. And then ultimately what happens, white flight has escalated by the later 1960s. Black kids who are in public schools in Atlanta find themselves sometimes going to school even on double sessions, meaning the schools are so overcrowded because desegregation is not happening. You have like one shift going in the morning and one going in the afternoon. And some of the white schools actually have empty spaces, right? So Black parents are trying to figure out, where do we send our kids to school? We are products of segregated Black schools. We know the value of segregated Black schools. In some ways, they probably benefited from the height of the segregated Black schools, because Southern states actually started pumping money into segregated Black schools in the early 50s to avoid the Brown decision. They were like, we can have separate but equal, right? So they started pumping money into segregated Black schools. But public school desegregation was not happening on the terms of Black people. It was happening on the terms of white leaders still, right? So Black parents are trying to figure out what to do, and especially if they saw that their kids were very high achieving, right? And for some Black parents who have been to PWIs, especially for graduate school, I think they saw this world changing,
I just
right?
want to hear what that acronym is. Predominantly white institutions. I think
Predominantly white institutions,
by now,
right?
just in case. Okay.
Yeah. And so they're trying to figure out what to do, right? And so Westminster is seen as an academic option first and foremost, because Westminster had one of the first AP programs in the South, right? And so Black parents are recognizing the academic program that's available at Westminster, but they very much also are in this quandary because they know that the kids are not going to get necessarily the social and psychological support that they will need in that space, right? But in this era, a few Black parents decide we should also be in these spaces. Our kids to also have these resources, right? The cover of the book shows you what Westminster looked like in the 1960s. 180-acre campus, right? For the kids, one of my interviewees, one of the Fearless First talks, Jannard, he talks about, the difference of going from a segregated Black school in the city of Atlanta out to Buckhead, Westminster. I mean, it's like day and night difference in terms of facilities and resources, right? And they too had, for some, it was a financial concern. So the Stauffer Foundation was this short-lived Southern foundation. So some of them were supported financially, there was no way that even for middle-class Black parents that they could afford the tuition at Westminster, right? So it was really them reckoning with kind of, how do we get the best academics situation for our kids in this changing climate? The Civil Rights Act had been passed, but also kind of reconciling that we probably going to have to do some things outside of school to help with that social and psychological support of our kids.
Yeah.
So
yeah. Similar to what we do now, right?
Exactly. Right. There's this constant kind of balancing act, right? And so these are the first. These are the 9 of the Fearless First that I interviewed for the book. There were about a total of 35 Black students who entered Westminster in the first 5 years of school desegregation, and about 25 of them would go on to graduate. And I was fortunate to interview these 9 for the book.
Yeah. So what were some of the experiences that these Fearless First had integrating Westminster?
Yeah. Michael McBabe, top row here, second picture from the left. Michael was reluctant to talk with me. It was a very difficult experience for him. It took his younger brother, Ron, to convince him to talk with me. And because I told Ron, I said, Michael will be in the dissertation and perhaps hopefully it'll be a book one day, because Michael had the biggest footprint in the school newspaper because he was a writer and a political cartoonist in the school newspaper when he was a senior in junior and senior in high school, right? So Ron ultimately convinced Michael to talk with me. And this let me know, right? This quote on page 114 in the book let me know why Michael was hesitant to go there with me, right? So he writes, and I think this wasn't an email. And I took them however they wanted to talk with me. For some, it was by email. They felt more comfortable. Some, it was by phone. Some, it was in person, right? And some, we did 2 and 3 interviews. For others, they maybe only had 30 minutes to an hour, right? But this is what Michael wrote, right? He said, during that first year, I vividly recall that my brother was having, no, I'm sorry. This is what Michael writes. That was what Ron had told me. This is what Michael says. No one could have prepared me for the psychological scarring I was about to receive. The very first day of class, 8th grade, I walked in. The dominant white males, about 8 of them or so, many on the football team, immediately surrounded me. I said to myself, how nice. I naively thought they are welcoming me to class. Then they proceeded to humiliate, hit, push, shove, punch, and haze me into hysterics such that I ran to the bathroom to hide and cry. That's first day of 8th grade, 1967 for Michael, right? Ron remembers Michael coming home because Ron at this time was still at the laboratory school affiliated with the AUC, with the Atlanta University Center, where their parents worked. And Ron remembers Michael coming home, just talking about the kids picking on him. He says, Ron told me, one thing I specifically recall is that it was the season of the 17-year locusts, or the cicadas. When they emerged from the ground, they shed the outer casing of their exoskeleton, leaving a hollowed out hard mold of this bug lying around in the grass. The white kids would put these shells in my brother's hair, finding it funny that they would get caught up in the naps of his afro and he couldn't get them out of his hair very easily. So you had a mixture of very overt racism, such as what Michael experienced, right? Jannard didn't necessarily, there were a few incidents at the school, but Jannard talks about how he came in as a 6 foot tall 8th grader, Mr. Athletic. So he didn't experience as much at Westminster per se, even though there was a major incident with a coach who ultimately got fired, who through language that he talked about in the locker room. But when they would go to other places in Georgia to play sports, right outside of Atlanta, he would get it from the other teams and from the refs, right? Dawn Clark was 5th grade when she entered in 1967. And it took me, she says, Michelle, it took you about 2 or 3 times calling me and explaining your purpose before I was willing to talk with you. And she talked about how she would show up. I mean, it sounds like the kids themselves may have been nice at times, even though some were mean to her at school. Like some did trip her, some did write the N-word on her notebooks. But then there were some who seemed to be nice because she would show up at their house because they had invited her to a party, and she and her mom would get to the door and the parents would say, oh no, you have the wrong day and time, right? They didn't pick her for I think it was the Girl Scout troop at Westminster. So she ultimately had to join in with Joya and others who were part of a Girl Scout troop in their neighborhood in the Southwest or SWAT area of Atlanta, right? Malcolm was the first boarding student. At that time, Westminster had a boarding component, and Malcolm was coming from Virginia. And now Malcolm, when I met Malcolm, I only interviewed him by phone when I was doing all my interviews. He lives in San Francisco. And then I met him in person as I was working on revisions of the dissertation, getting into a book format. And he said, Michelle, it's not that I never thought about Westminster. He said, I just never thought I would talk about it. So this notion that you feel like you would never talk about like what you actually experienced in high school still kind of really sits with me like, that is deep, right? Like these years that are supposed to be quote unquote good years of your life, right? Before adulting gets harder, you don't even think you're going to talk about it, right? And so as a boarding student, he came home to find a hunting knife sticking out of his side of the closet. He found, nigger written on his notebooks, right? He was ready to leave, but his mom said, no, you're going to keep trying. And ultimately some white students helped to save him, right? Like who stood up to the bullies, right? And then, and so there are all these different examples, right? And Joya was most poignant at talking about this kind of this subtle racism, right? This notion of always kind of feeling like an outsider, right? There was one major incident that she remembers on the basketball court. I think she entered in 5th grade in like 1969, but she said, I always kind of had this feeling of not quite belonging, right? Because of the looks or you felt like people were telling inside jokes at your expense, those types of things, right? So I'm grateful to all of them. I'm still in touch with them on occasion. Interestingly, this summer, some of the younger alumni of Westminster reached out to me as they were working on their pushback and during this moment of these continued moments of racial injustice and reckoning with America's past and present. And some of these older alumni now are involved in some of the initiatives happening at the school.
So that was the experience this summer at Black Sat, right?
Yep.
Our alum and our current students have said, you know what, we are going to talk about it.
Yep.
We're going to talk about the good because
Yep.
many of them are doing, they're scholars. They are banging it out of the park academically, right? But they refuse to be silent about the microaggressions, the subtleties, the racial moments and or trauma that can happen,
Exactly.
Some students experience it more than others, but the beauty of it is that they have enough self advocacy to create a set of demands. Right. So it's not just about the testimonial, but it's about, well, where are we going to go from here and how are we going to make it better for the next group of students that are
exactly.
Yeah.
And what's so powerful, right, is that, and each of these folks, I focused intentionally on those who desegregated who also graduated from the school, right? There's another project to be done on Black folks who started at these schools in the late 60s and 70s and chose to not either continue at Westminster or the first school they went to another one, or chose to go back to public schools, right? But all these folks went on to, top colleges and universities. Wanda Ward was one of the first women, period, let alone Black women, to go to Princeton in 1972, right? So all trailblazers in their own right. But what's so interesting, right, is this summer with all the Black ad accounts that I'm reading, some of the same stuff.
Yeah.
Issues with hair, issues with not knowing the students' names, right? Knowing them apart, right? Let alone more egregious things around the use of the N-word, right? And just more overt racial issues, the curricular issues, right? Teachers, and issues of discipline, right? So it always seems as though it's the Black and brown kids who are getting disciplined at higher rate. We know that's true in public schools, right? We have plenty of data on that in public schools, right? But we also are getting the testimonials about how that discipline issue plays out also in the private schools, right? And so this was one of my, when I saw this in the school newspaper, I was like, this is just golden, right? So this was Michael speaking out, when I asked them, I said, well, what did y'all think of the Black Power movement? Because they're on the heels of being in school. King is assassinated spring of 68. Then Black Power is coming, to the forefront, right? And they're like, you need to talk to Michael McBay. Michael was like our level, our voice of consciousnness, right? So this cartoon, but it's amazing, right? Basically, he and this librarian are going back and forth about who, which student are you? Because she doesn't know, like his whole point is, you don't know if I'm Malcolm, you don't know if I'm Isaac, you don't know if I'm Mike, you don't know if I'm Jannard.
And there are not many of us.
Right. Right. This is what, 71, probably 72, maybe.
Same stories.
Same thing I read this summer on the Black ad accounts. 2020, right? Literally, you could have taken some of the examples from the hashtag Black ad accounts this summer and put them back in 67 through 72, or taking some of these and put them in 2020.
Yeah.
Right. So while there has been, I would say, and my students always push me on this, they were like, well, Professor Purdy, so we don't think there's been any progress.
Mm.
Right? Well, I said, well, look, y'all wouldn't be here in the numbers that you are in at WashU if there hadn't been some progress. Right? I wouldn't be here teaching you if there hadn't been some progress. But with progress comes resistance.
Oh, yes.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, our young people, I think sometimes, I mean, especially in these last, 5 to 10 years, it's been very difficult for them to come of age during this time in United States history, right? Especially, when my students, when we, experience in St. Louis, we experienced the death of Mike Brown, right? And all of that came along with it, and the vindication of Darren Wilson. I mean, it's just been so much these last years, several years, so that they begin to question, right? But what we all know is that you have to stay vigilant, right? And that's what RIISE is helping to do, right? Is hold these schools accountable. You can have it all day long in your mission statement, right? That you are a champion for diversity and equity, but they have to be held accountable.
Yeah. And our students are really at the forefront of holding our schools accountable.
Yep.
Later on, we're going to hear from 3 student leaders from Black Students Demanding Change. And I mean, listen, their plates are full. They're applying to colleges, but they are still holding space to make demands of their schools. And we've seen how schools can adapt in a moment, in a flash with COVID, right?
Yep.
So I think, these 2 pandemics kind of converging together. And I want to really hear from you. What do you think is going to be the next 20 years? What do you think the next 20 years is going to look like, considering that we have what we have going on right now with our students demanding change and our parents right there backing them up?
Yeah. So I think about summer of 2020, right? It was a long summer, and it was a summer of reckoning with racial justice, right? And we're still reckoning with this whole, I mean, we got we're 9 days away, right? From an election that really in many ways is about a reckoning, right? With racial injustice, right? And what are going to be kind of I was reading this morning about, how the current occupant of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue loves to tout what he did for HBCUs. And it's a very complicated, it's more complicated than obviously what he presents, right? In terms of kind of where HBCU leaders stand with him and don't stand with him, right? That's another story for another day, but it's really kind of like a racial, it's this reckoning, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think 20 years from now, if these young people, what they did this summer was tremendous.
Tremendous. So proud.
Right? Both in K through 12 and in higher ed, right? I think what has to continue to happen are more developed Black and brown folks of color alumni groups, right? Because institutions know students come and go.
Yes.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So the students have put it out there, and they have put it out there probably once before or multiple times at these institutions, right? So what has to happen is a sustained effort by alumni, by parents, former parents, Black folks who get on the board of trustees, the list goes on, right? To continue to hold these institutions accountable and to keep telling what happened, right?
Keep telling our
so when Michael Brown was killed, and I'm in my second year of being an assistant professor back at WashU in St. Louis, which is I say back at because that's my undergrad alma mater, right? Some of the students didn't realize that I was involved, right, with the 30th anniversary of the Association of Black Students, where we revisited the 68 Black Manifesto, and we revisited the demands that Black students made in the 60s that had been revisited, I think, once before in the 80s. We revisited in the late 90s to say, this is where we see the university this is where we see the university has done. This is where we want the university to go, And so even for those of us who are in higher ed, right, we have to do the same thing, because the students on the ground today need to know, what did y'all do before we were there, right?
Totally agree with you, with alumni, current students, and parents working in tandem, and there's an organization called Independent Trust that many folks may have heard about, run by Tina Gary, and it is focused on alumni utilizing their presence, their power, and their pocketbook to
Yep.
come in and help their schools achieve their mission,
Yep.
right?
Exactly.
And to be there with their students. So I'm excited about the next 20 years.
I am too.
And
And I mean, even I will say this, even if for some reason November 3rd does not go the way I would like for it to go, I think there is still so much pressure that's going to be exerted, right? That we will get to 2024 with a change at the very top. But I think what's key to remember is, within these last 5 to 10 years, we've seen changes at the local level, right? So people really understanding the power of certain local officials to really enact racial justice. We've seen not as many changes at the state level, but they're coming, right? And then it was 2018 that, that the House of Representatives flipped, right? So there is, because you can't have action without policy. You can't have protest without policy, right? And so, and especially within the ways in which the United States is structured, right? So I think that the pushes will continue to come, and that is what's most, I think, inspiring. People are not going to let this go now.
So in our last minute together, before we go into a break, a 5-minute break, everyone, you'll be able to transition into the school fair. We have 19 notable schools who clearly, many of them are RIISE member schools. They absolutely align with what it is that RIISE believes in, which is the cultural capital of our Black and Brown families and our place in these independent schools, right? To be free to be who we are in these schools, and supported and given the toolkit, that's part of what we need to do as parents, but our schools as well, to make sure that the social and emotional wellness of our children as they navigate predominantly white affluent institutions, and make those grades and go on to do amazing things, is protected. So what would you say in the last, I guess, 30 seconds now, to the prospective parents that are on, who are like, well, wait, I thought I was supposed to be in a place that was going to inspire and empower me. I'm more nervous now, I know what my vision is for my children's education, and it is an independent school, and I'm not going to let anybody stand in my way around that. But what would you say to inspire our parents as we move on to the next section?
Sure, I would say, I would still say, be inspired, right? The academic resources, as well as so many others at independent schools, are phenomenal, right? One of the things I felt like I was able to do, and that others, we were able to explore so much, right? Without question in some ways, which was really powerful growing up in the 80s and the 90s in Jackson, Mississippi, right? So be definitely cognizant of all the opportunities that an independent school can afford you. But at the same time, I would say, as my parents did, be on top of things as well, right? Check in with the teachers, check in with the head of school, use RIISE as a community to support you and your kids as well. And so it's a combination, but definitely be hopeful and to know what these schools can provide your kids.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Purdy.
Thank you for having me.
Go get this book. Every independent school should own this book. Every family should have this book as well. It is inspirational. It's a lot more stories. If you're a research buff, this is it, right? This is it. So thank you. And we have absolutely grabbed on to the title of this book, and we use it often. We are here to transform the elite. So I thank you for this foundation.
You're welcome.
And for sharing the Fearless First with us. And we look forward to sharing the new crop of Fearless First with everyone after the school fair. So I'm going to ask folks to go ahead and begin. Hold on one second, Dr. Purdy, too. Shift now, if you go back to the platform, to the web app, you're going to be able to take a look at the different schools. Their sessions are going on at 3:05. So we have about 4 minutes. Go get some water, do what you got to do, make a phone call. If you're having problems, know folks who are having problems getting on, I'll be free to address that in a moment. But we're going to have two sessions, 3:05 to 3:50. I think I had that right, is the first session, and then 3:55 to 4:40 is the second session. You can go in and out of sessions as often as you want, or you can just stay put and ask really great questions. And our schools are going to be running their own Zoom room, and we're reminding everybody to record so that it can add to our on-demand experience post-event. So thank you so much for joining us today, and make sure that we come back at 4:45 to this very same link. It's on the agenda at the bottom to hear from our Fearless First. We're going to hear from Ayana, we're going to hear from Inshira, and we're going to hear from Bethany. And I have two phenomenal parent leaders that will be joining me then to just ask them the questions that you probably want to know the answers to, because they are our testimony. They are our legacy. You know, it's about our children and our children's children, and you will definitely be inspired by their brilliance and their bravery